Hey, it's Travel Gigolo, and for National Heritage Day, also known as National Braai Day, I'm going to show you how to braai nice, juicy picanha on the charcoal braai, as well as some vors and some skilled pikeys, which are a South African favorite. First thing we're going to do is get the fire going. Now, for what we want to do, we're going to do the fat first, and for that we're going to need relatively low heat. So the picanha has a thick layer of fat on the one side, and it is in fact a type of rump cut. So what you want to do is render that fat first before you cook the steak. So to render the fat nice and slowly, we want a relatively low heat. So I'm going to start by putting some charcoal onto the grate so I can determine exactly how much charcoal I need just for the fat alone, and then we'll add some later to get the heat up and do the meat part of it too. And that's about enough coal just to get some nice heat in there, some nice low heat, and that will render the fat. And to set the coals going, we're going to use this. This is a Weber chimney. This is probably the best piece of braai equipment that I've ever purchased. So this gets your coals going really quickly, very little fuss, and we're going to chuck the coals in there, get some fire lighter under that, and get those coals nice and hot. And voila, a couple of minutes, we'll have some nice hot coals. Okay, so while this is going, we're going to start prepping the meat. And the first thing I need to do is get my hands nice and clean, and I need a bit of cloth for that. Okay, bit of cloth. Importantly, you want to get the steak up to room temperature approximately, so take it out of the fridge about an hour before you're going to braai, maybe more. And the reason you want to do that is so that you don't have the center of the meat being colder than the outside, that it doesn't cook through properly. This is a nice thick piece of picanha. As I said earlier, it's got a nice rind of fat on there. What we're going to do now is we're going to score that fat, and the reason we do that is that the fat tends to shrink faster than the meat when you cook it. So in order for this thing to maintain its shape and not to start squashing up and curling as the fat contracts, we're going to score a set of diamond shapes in there, and that just makes it cook a bit quicker as well, because then you get heat penetrating where those cuts are as well. Okay, so scoring this is fairly straightforward. You want a nice sharp knife, and what you're going to do basically is just cut through into the fat, not too deep. You don't want to go all the way into the meat. You really just want to score into the fat only, if you can manage that. So a bit of finesse and a bit of experience will help with that. That's nice and scored now, and you can see that I've cut it in two directions. That's important because it's going to shrink from all directions. So if you only cut it one way, then you're still going to get the meat shrinking in the direction that it has not been cut, because that fat's going to get shorter and shorter. So the next thing to do now is to put a nice crust of salt on there, and we're ready to get it on the braai. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is just pat the meat dry on both sides, just to get rid of any excess moisture, and then I'm going to start with the salt crust. So just a quick pat. Remember to pat both sides of the meat, in particular because if you don't pat both sides, and when you put the meat back down, you're going to have that excess moisture on the board again. So let's just get rid of some of that there. Right, get that aside, get that meat back on top there. Now, salt-wise, I like to use rock salt. Some people will want to grind it on there and you get fairly fine salt. I prefer to use the thicker or larger pieces of rock salt myself. I find that with the really finely ground salt, you use a lot more salt to start with, and it's also a little bit more to brush off the excess salt when you are finished braaiing. Nice thick crust of salt we're going to put on there. Right, so that's a nice thick layer of salt on there. I'm going to give that a minute just to nicely cover the meat and get stuck to it as it draws out a little bit of moisture from the salt. In the meantime, I'm gonna get the coals in all the right places and we can get the grill on, get that grill nice and warm, and then get the meat on there, fat side down. Right, coals are nice and ready. We're gonna put those on the grill. Woo. Okay, be sure to spread them out quite evenly so that you get a nice continuous low heat on the fat side of the picanha. Right, time to put our piece of picanha on the grill. So some of the salt's going to come off as you do this, but that's inevitable. And the idea is to put it down nice and gently so that you don't lose too much of the salt in the process, which of course is easier said than done. So what we want now is to just keep that fat on there. We're not going to move the meat because we don't want to get the salt coming off the fat crust. And that's just going to stay there for a few minutes until that fat is nicely rendered through. We are not going to close the grill because we don't want to overcook the steak as well. So depending on how you like your steak, of course, I prefer my steak to be medium rare. And if you close the grill, then you're going to cook the meat through and you may get a piece that's well done. So it really depends on what you want and how you prefer your steak. Cheers. Now to wait a few minutes, get that fat nice and rendered, and remember to stand upwind of the smoke. Okay, so now it's been about 6 or 7 minutes and that fat is nice and golden at the bottom at this point, nicely rendering through. What I'm going to do now is this is a very thick piece of meat, so we do want to warm the meat up as well so that it does cook through. If we just turn it over now and put the heat on, we're going to get a nice caramelized surface of the meat, but it's not going to cook all the way through. So I'm going to shut the Weber now, get that convective heating on, and that will start to slowly cook through the meat as well. So we're going to do that for a couple of minutes as well. Get that nice thick slab of meat warmed up so it starts to cook through. And then when it's nice and warm and relatively cooked through, we're going to quickly add some more coals and turn it around, get it nice and brown on the other side. This is moving at a relatively slow pace because it's not very hot in there, just a few coals. I've also shut the air down a little so that we don't get too much air going through there, and that keeps the heat down as well. Now, the next thing we want is to allow that meat, it's a really thick slab of meat, so we want to get that to warm up nicely. If we turn it over now and start browning it, we're going to have relatively raw meat on the inside, and I want it medium rare. So, going to let that keep going. Going to get some more coals, put them in the Weber chimney, get those nice and hot so that they're ready for the next phase of cooking the picanha. Now the meat's been cooking for a while, we're going to turn it over and start browning it. The first thing we're going to do is add a few extra coals, which you should of course prepare a few minutes before the time. So that is going to get the heat up nice and high, good to brown our steak on the other side. Just going to spread them out a bit. We want a relatively uniform set of heat coming through onto the grill. So getting this back on the grill. Going to now turn the meat over nice and carefully. We don't want all that salt to get lost. Nice golden crust on the fat, and that's exactly what we want. And now let's let that go for a couple of minutes again, just browning the other side of the meat and cooking through as well a bit from the other side. So I think our picanha is ready. We're going to take it off the coals, put it on the cutting board, give it about 10 minutes to rest so that all those juices get nice and soaked in again and we don't start losing them as soon as we cut them. It's a beautiful golden crust. While our picanha is resting and getting all those juices soaked up, we're going to move on to a South African mainstay and staple at the braai, which is some nice boerewors. Right, and as the flames die down, we're going to put a few skilpakkies on here as well. That is basically liver that's wrapped in a bit of fat, and that's also a bit of a traditional staple in South Africa. This is a really nice snack to have a bit later on. So just going to put those on there, low heat, put the cover on and let that cook through. And now the moment of truth has arrived. We're going to slice into our picanha and hopefully it's cooked just the way we want it all the way through with this lovely crust of golden fat on the top. And that looks just perfect. Right, time to taste a bit of this delicious picanha and see if it lives up to my expectations. Absolutely perfect, beautiful. Quick slice for the camera crew as well. Apparently it's really good. That's how you make a really great picanha. Remember, it's a really thick piece of meat, so you've got to let it rest for a fair amount after you've grilled it. You want to, of course, do it relatively slowly, get that fat nice and rendered through. Gives you lots of flavor coming through, and salt crust as well, of course, on the outside. That's just the perfect amount of salt that you need. You don't need to add any more salt after that. You want it medium rare. Medium rare is great. I think that's where you get the most flavor, but of course you can cook it to whatever standard you prefer. And the thing to do now, of course, is to slice it up nice and ready to eat. Hope you enjoyed that. Hit the like button, click subscribe and smash the bell if you want to get notifications for future episodes.